Hello and welcome, Fright fans, to this, the Horror Story Corner, where tonight we have a terrifying tale of torment, written by yours truly. It concerns a man facing his own death, a man with a secret that burns at his mind and drives him to confess. He should be careful, however. This confession may not quite lead to salvation, and instead, it may just bring him here, to us, in the Horror Story Corner. If you like this story, please comment below and feel free to listen to some of my other original tales, which have all been neatly packaged into a playlist entitled Original Horror Stories Written by the Horror Story Corner. And if that doesn't scratch your horror itch, why not look into Stephen Sinclair's or Mike Llana's original work, which also feature on the channel. For now, however, I hope you enjoy the Confessional. Everything, until Stanley reached the tall stone steps, had been a blur. There was a persistent ringing in his head and a searing pain in his sinuses. They were tightly congested, which made blowing into the cotton handkerchief laboursome, and it produced no small amount of blood. The pressure behind his eyes was the worst it had ever been. Squinting, and with hazed vision, he looked up at the imposing building, so solid and stern, so sure in its singular purpose, almost arrogant. He wasn't a religious man, nor had he ever been inclined towards believing in an afterlife. However, when there is a visible and tangible number of days left written beside your name, strange things begin to happen in the mind. It clutches at something, any form of hope. At first, Stanley had felt the overwhelming urge to confess to the girl's brother, but he came to his senses before knocking at her front door. Flashes of confrontation, fury, and a much swifter death than the one he was awaiting dissuaded him from pursuing that particular route of forgiveness. So instead, and still not thoroughly convinced that he would reap any benefit, he found himself at church. Yet on the cold, hard steps, a harder and colder reality seized him, and he questioned how it could be that a priest or any mortal could hold sway over the forgiveness of a divine force. Furthermore, and to that point, how could there possibly be a divine force? Stanley had seen firsthand the darker, festering nature of our rotten earth, which would be enough to drive the belief out of even the most pious and devout. He pondered there on the steps, crumpled and unmoving, thinking between the flashes of agony. Men and women passed him by without making eye contact, assuming he was some homeless down and out. He felt the regret and the guilt flood into him, tearing at his being, causing a sickening dread to fill his stomach. Before, all he had ever felt was anger, and in the periods between the anger there was nothing. A cool nothingness, far less than indifference. Emptiness couldn't describe it either, because the term conjures a sadness, and really there was no emotion at all. It was a coldness that didn't bite. It allowed him to be methodical between the periods of anger, and it kept him from prison until the point that his own body had given him a death sentence. "Are you coming in?" called an ethereal voice that snapped him away from the ever-thickening gloom that his thoughts were becoming. He stopped, realizing that although the door of the church lay open, and that had been the direction of the utterance, he could perceive no physical presence. Indeed, after throwing several glances around the immediate vicinity, Stanley could see no one around at all. He had, however, heard the voice, though it was not outside of the realms of possibility that he had imagined it. It had been a stressful 24 hours. At least, he thought it had. Much of the time didn't quite make sense, and there were large periods that were missing. He remembered speaking with the doctor, who had been blunt about the extent of the cancer, Then he remembered being at her front door, the light from the living room bathing him in much the same way that it had the first time he had been there, peering in through the bay window, unseen. He was good at being unseen. Just another fixture of the world, an unassuming face within a more vibrant and exciting crowd. Then, after he'd pulled himself away from her house, he was here, on these steps. There was very little in between these disconnected moments. The thought of the blank spaces and missing links in his memory made the dread pull tighter at his stomach, as though there was something terrible in the forgetting, something macabre that was just out of sight and waiting to pounce. He dismissed the worry and focused instead on his pain and guilt. "Are you coming in?" the same ethereal voice repeated, stronger and more definite. Stanley cast his gaze towards the door quickly and saw something move just out of sight. Instantly, yet struggling for balance, he got up and, forgetting his musings momentarily, he ran as best he could to the open doorway. But as he peered inside and as his eyes adjusted to the contrasting dim light, he saw no one. Just an empty church narthex. But not an unimpressive one. He was stood at the western entrance and was greeted by 3 large inner doorways, the central of which being the largest and grandest, adorned with a striking top architrave featuring faded but still beautiful gilded carvings of what looked to be Jesus and his disciples engaging in some form of feast other than the famous Last Supper. A fittingly large chandelier hung just above them and illuminated 5 miniature painted domes in the ceiling, each intricate and lavishly decorated in paints of deep red, striking purples and glistening golds. The grandeur was apparent, but a new and bizarre choking anxiety inside of him, born from the oddness of the voice and the lingering feeling that the gaps in his mind were blotting out something devastatingly important, strangled out all appreciation for anything noteworthy or of beauty. Not that Stanley ever paid much attention to such things in the best of times. He stepped toward the doorway, wanting to quieten his nerves, wanting to find the source of the voice, imagining that as he did, some force would work against him. Some god would bar him from entry and strike him down, or perhaps the tumour would consume his brain instantly, putting an end to him. Neither of these occurred, though, and once inside, he stood for a moment, allowing the coolness of the dim room to sweep across his heated body. It helped his mind clear as he steadily drew in the air and noticed his own slow breathing. Well, you've passed the threshold. Nothing for it but to come deeper inside now. Come, share your troubles. The voice was again ethereal, so much so that Stanley questioned if he had heard it or thought it himself. Its indistinct nature was beginning to agitate more than alarm. There was no one in the room with him, and no clear line of sight of anyone in the part of the nave that he could see. Choosing to dismiss it as either advancing cancer, fancy, or tomfoolery from some unseen presence, he decided not to let it become his central focus for the time being, and he moved toward the door that was furthest to his left, noticing 2 votive stands with money boxes at each side, and he considered lighting a candle. He felt around in his pocket, but there was no change, and, not wanting to further his sins, left his chosen candle unlit. As he moved past them, all but 2 extinguished in his wake. Once through the door, he was struck by the vault ceiling that was a mass of crisscrossing stone lines which climbed upward from the large stone pillars and ran down the length of the nave. They created an odd effect upon the senses and somehow both extended and shortened the length of the building. It made Stanley oddly queasy. The air was stiff, as it usually is in such establishments, but there was something else in it. It was very hard to detect and easily dismissible, but there was a scent of something wholly unchurch-like about the place, a sort of subtle yet omnipresent sense of rotting or rottenness, or something the opposite of holy. Move forward. You have almost reached your intended destination. On the left. This voice, though unrecognizable, was seeming ever more existent only in Stanley's mind, and this both concerned and settled him. The concern stemmed from a fear of his advancing ailment, but the settling feeling occurred as he realized there may be no hidden watcher, no supernatural voyeur that knew his concealed purpose. Just an angry tumour consuming his brain. Just the darkness of a natural approaching death. He did as the voice instructed and traced his vision down to the left, whereupon he noticed a small yet ornate confessional made of sturdy-looking dark-stained oak. For some reason, Stanley had imagined these structures curtained or with the penitent's doorway open for viewing by the public. However, this confessional had heavy-looking oaken doors, with carvings that may have been depictions of the Garden of Eden. There was a prominent snake in the centre, an apple held tightly within its mouth. The middle of the structure was adorned by two angry-looking figures that Stanley could not place, and were no doubt some likeness of disapproving saints. Their scorn almost made him want to turn around. After all, he thought, who were they to judge him? Come in. Seek your salvation. The same voice called out, but this time it had a single, definite origin, and had emanated from the right side of the confessional. Following the instruction, there was almost an agonizingly strong feeling of dread in Stanley's stomach, which had slowly intensified the further he had gotten into the building. It warned him suddenly, much more violently, against advancing. Yet burning stronger was his curiosity, and his new need for forgiveness. Both of these drove him to open and enter the left door of the confessional. Inside, he was pleased that there was a comfortable-looking chair to sit upon, upholstered in a deep red fabric. Again, this went against his preconceived notion of confessionals, and the idea that he would need to kneel before God and the priest. Once seated, he looked to his left, and noticed the shadow sitting on the other side of the obscuring latticed opening. Both parties remained silent for some time as Stanley shifted uncomfortably in his chair, not knowing how to begin. "Hello," he said finally. "Was it you that called me in, Father? Should I call you Father, or is it Lord or Priest?" There was no immediate reply, so Stanley continued to fill the silence awkwardly. "I heard you, I think, outside on the steps. You could sense I was troubled, no doubt?" "When was your last confession?" the priest uttered, and the voice was the same one that had called Stanley to the confessional. I must be honest, Father," Stanley let out an uncertain sigh. "I've never confessed to anything before. Not to a priest, not to a teacher, not to my mother, no one." "Are you Catholic?" inquired the priest. "I'm afraid I haven't had much of an appreciation for religion throughout my life, Father, but I'm now driven to take some solace in it. Your candour is appreciated. Shall we begin?" "I'm sorry, Father. I've seen movies, but I'm not sure how. I mean, I don't really know what to say. Do I need to cross myself and then say, 'Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned'?" There was a low but audible laugh from behind the veiling lattice. "That's fine. Let's step away from the formalities, shall we? Just begin. Tell me what has brought you here, and why you are feeling troubled." It's hard for me. I'm dying," Stanley said, feeling stupid, helpless, and more than a little lost. "I'm sorry to hear that," returned the unseen listener, seemingly solemn. Then the ridiculousness of this ritual hit Stanley, causing him to feel with a sudden need to exit, to be back out onto the street, away from this confessional. He flushed with want for solitude and isolation that could be afforded to him by returning to his meagre flat, blotting out the daylight and curling up deep below his duvet. "You don't need to go," the priest placed, apparently reading his thoughts. "I can tell when a penitent... when someone is uncomfortable. I understand, but I assure you, confessing to me will do you no harm, and ultimately, you may feel better. Even if you aren't religious, or more so if you do not believe in a god or thereafter, you may still find some solace in another human being knowing your story. Beyond religion, that is what I offer you, my son." These words quelled Stanley somewhat, and he eased himself back into the surprisingly comforting chair. "Okay," he said. "And everything I state is private. You can't tell anyone, even if it's bad, even if you judge me for it." "Do you fear my judgment?" asked the priest. "Well, no, but all the same, it would be going against the church for me to disclose anything that you state, even to the police. The punishment would be severe. Besides having broken my sacred duty, I may well be defrocked. Believe me, no matter your sin, it will not leave this confessional." Stanley started to relax. Never in his life had he been given the chance to speak so frankly and without consequence, to fully delve and divulge what he was, and the thought that this could be done without any repercussions transformed the fear he had been feeling into a slow-building exhilaration. "I think, Father, I'm just going to talk, and I'm going to talk about many different things. Some may be connected, but they might not be. I tend not to analyse causality. I leave that to minds more inclined towards psychiatry, or is it psychology or sociology? I don't know. I'm not particularly book smart or any kind of smart, really. I suppose that ultimately I do wish for forgiveness, but more than that, I wish to be known by at least one other soul on this earth. I didn't know that, not until you just made it so accessible to me, but I do want it. I do. Maybe then, in some way, I'll go on after my life is drawn to an end. Through what you hear today, you'll carry me with you. You, by the very act of listening, become sort of a vessel for the darkest part of me, my inky black soul. I'm going to start, Father, if that's okay. Stanley was struck by his own level of politeness, by how much he cared about ensuring he was courteous to the priest. He had never behaved this way toward anyone before. He had never felt the need for platitudes, and yet here he was, feeling things, no doubt due to the realization that he was dying, but a changing and less harsh man, perhaps one who could be forgiven, absolved. "You may tell me all you wish," stated the priest. "Unburden yourself. I shall listen without comment until you have finished, or unless you speak in a manner that warrants response. Speak and unburden yourself." "Okay, well, I guess I'll go back to childhood. I was a meek one, runt really. Most of the rest of my family were tough, often getting into fights, in trouble with the law. Built, strong, hard, no emotions, or at least not showing any. My mum and my dad were standoffish, cold towards me. I don't recall ever being hugged or anything close to it, really. Meanwhile, beatings were a regular staple, and my dad was quite handy with the big brass belt buckle. I was never quite sure why they had me. I may well have been a mistake. They never said, never would. And if there was something I wanted to know, well, I reckon they would have taken pleasure in not letting me know it. They weren't the worst parents in the world. They just weren't any kind of parents, actually. they just drifted on with their own lives, feeding me, watering me, and providing little else. Anyway, they died when I was 13. Car crash. I was in the back. Most of it after the impact is a blur, but I remember standing in the cemetery, their bodies being lowered into the ground and feeling nothing. No emotion, just cold. I think that's what I felt for most of my life. I never really fit in. Never truly laughed at a joke or felt friendship towards a peer. I don't really understand emotions. Well, not all of them anyway. But I reckon I've looked at how they look long enough to fake them pretty darn well. I used to be quite proud of it, as a matter of fact. Just how much I could seem like a human. Walk like a human, talk like a human, and appear human to all those around me, without actually being one. Being different, you know? What am I thinking? A humanist such as yourself. Of course you don't. I moved in with my aunt after their deaths. My parents, I mean. And she used to touch me. The less said about that, the better. It probably had some effect, but it makes me sick to dwell, so I won't. She died too. The bitch. Not that I really felt much about it. It's just that Stanley paused to collect his jumble of ideas, just for a moment. Today, Father, for the first time, things seem to be getting to me, and I'm not sure why. It's perplexing, if that's the right word. You'll forgive me if it isn't, though, right? But it's perplexing and a little maddening, and I don't need it, Father. Not with dying, I don't need it. I've been treated badly, you see. I could go on about it. I won't, but I could. The scorn, the beating, the spit in my face, buckets and buckets of it. Honestly, I could go on until I'm quite mad, and until it would make anyone else quite pitying, Father. But I won't. I'll stick to my sins, because for some reason, God only knows why, today they're really starting to burn at my soul. Today I can honestly say I've grown a conscience. The priest coughed, as though he wanted to say something, but he didn't. He let Stanley continue. So, I was 18. No real prospects, no real friends, and no family. And I had a shitty job in a small flat. Same flat I'm in now, as it happens. And as I said, I didn't really have many feelings. There was certainly no desire to better myself, no ambition. I heard that psychopaths are often very successful because they can just bully their way to the top with no remorse. I feel like I could have bullied my way up and felt nothing, but I didn't have the drive, so I suppose I'm not a psychopath, or at least not a very good one. I stagnated, only really feeling lust and occasionally anger. The lust I'd save by saving up and hiring cheap oars. The anger, well, I don't know really. It'd always go black when I was angry. Here, the priest chimed in, softly and delicately. Did you hurt someone, Stanley? There was a momentary silence before he clarified. What I mean to say is, in these anger blackouts, was anyone hurt? Couldn't really tell you, Father, Stanley placed coolly. A couple of times there was blood on my hands that wasn't mine. A couple of times the people who I was talking to before it went black were missing afterwards, but I can't say nothing about it for sure. No memory of the black spaces in between, and honestly I never really thought about those times again till now. I had no strong inclination to feel anything about them, you see, but it's so strange, Father. This dying thing has me shook because I'm starting to feel sick. Anxious, I think, is the right word. See, I studied emotions a bit so I could emulate them from time to time, and I know how they are meant to look, as I've said. I was even proud of it, but now I'm getting them. I'm finding the actual feeling different to how I imagined it, so I apologise if I use the wrong words. Anyway, when thinking about what I could have done in those periods of blackness, I think I'm anxious. And today, too, I have these even more horrible blank spaces in my memory, and I think I'm anxious about them too. Is that normal? Is it normal to feel sick when you aren't sure what happened? If there's a chance that you hurt someone, then yes. Yes, I'd say so. Stanley withdrew a cigarette and a match. He ran the match down the wall of the confessional, igniting it on the second attempt and then lighting his fag. He waited for the priest to tell him to stop, to tell him to put it out, but he remained silent. They both did. And Stanley smoked 2 cigarettes to the nubs. He was about to withdraw the third when the priest said, "I believe your habit is quite sated. Let's continue with our confession, shall we? Or is there something you're trying to put off?" "Lust." Stanley lowered his eyes and surveyed his palms. "Lust is what I could feel, Father. You know how hard it is to feel nothing but lust and anger? Lust being the only good thing. And what do you do when you've got no money, Father? Just pumping it away to the cold light of your TV screen. A man starts wanting to taste some flesh that hasn't been bought, wanting to feel the heartbeat of someone who wants him too. You get sick of the repulsion. You find it harder to stay hard." Stanley paused for a moment, shocked that the man behind the veil was allowing him to speak so candidly, so disgustingly freely. He wondered why he was choosing to put it so vulgarly and suspected that a part of him wanted scolding, wanted to be told off. A dark part of him didn't want to be accepted or forgiven, and instead longed to be driven out before he could finish. But he was also procrastinating. He didn't want to talk about her. So, I did what anyone in my fucked up situation would. I went out and I started looking at real women, and at first, looking was all I did. I'd go out to a bar or some cafe and I'd watch. I'd watch for a real long time, until someone caught my interest. Then, when I'd found the right one, I'd undress her in my mind. I'd picture her undressing for me. She'd be getting excited because she could have me. I imagined all the dirty nothings that would leave her pretty lips as she neared, tonguing at my ear. I imagined what she would do to me. Then I'd stop, Father. I'd go home, and I'd masturbate. But like anything, needs and addictions evolve, don't they? I started to masturbate in the pub or in the cafe. I'd do it under a thick coat, and I'd keep my face straight. Straighter than any you've seen. I made myself look especially bored. No one caught on. I was too good at it. I used to be proud of that. I tell you though, I don't feel nearly that way right now. Anyway, after a while, even that didn't do it for me no more. So then, you see, I started to follow them. "You're awfully quiet in there, Father. I'm starting to not like it. Starting to wonder what you're thinking. I never gave a shit what anyone was thinking before, but this cancer has got me screwy, and now I'm caring what you're thinking. You wishing you could turn me into the cops, Father, is that it?" Stanley began to sweat, and his heart pounded. All of this was new. His body was becoming alive with high doses of chemicals, electrical signals firing through synapses, all concocting new sensations that were hard to manage and deeply troubling. It aided him. It burnt him. "I'm just listening," quelled the priest, without any type of scorn detectable. "You are here to be forgiven. It means you are finally regretting your actions. And God is listening. Not just I alone. I will not judge you. But as long as you continue to be honest with me, I will absolve you." Just like that. Stanley found this prospect suspect and difficult to accept. "Not quite," said the priest. "But so long as you are truly sorry, truly seeking absolution in life, and truly ready to begin anew, then forgiveness awaits you. Now tell me the rest." Suspicious of the priest's motive, and suspicious of a God that would allow forgiveness of such a creature as himself, Stanley continued regardless. "I'd follow them home. I got caught the first few times and ran off, but I got better at following. Then I twitched myself as I watched them through their windows. Sometimes if I was really lucky and waited in the darkness long enough, they'd touch themselves too. Later I gained a bit more courage, and I started knocking on their doors. I wanted them to see me. That was all. I wanted to show them how good they made me feel, how much I wanted them. I thought that maybe it would make them want me too. But they just got scared. Silence abounded from the priest's side of the confessional. "Now listen here, priest," Stanley cried with an abrupt, vile anger. "I don't want you smutting this up. I ain't no damned sex offender, that's for damn sure. I didn't touch no one who didn't want me to touch them. Well, no one besides the hookers, of course, but they wanted the money at least. So get that out of your head. That's a sin I don't need to confess to." The silence remained. "Well, as I was saying," he continued, calmer but not entirely over his outburst. "They got scared, and I was only trying to show them, trying to let them know that they made me feel good. It was the only good feeling I could feel, but they screamed, and they ran for their phones, and they shouted at me to get out, and it went black. I don't know what I did. I might have hit them, I might have killed them, but I never did anything sexual, so you get that out of your head now." Stanley spat. "Are you even listening in there?" He was beginning to raise his voice once more, but the priest's calm manner lulled him somewhat. "I am still here, and I am still listening. You are not done, and I do not feel a need to pass comment. Any judging or guilt here is yours alone. And if you have truly never felt these sensations before, then I understand why you are finding all of this so difficult to comprehend. But I implore you, finish. Tell all, even that part that I sense you wish to share the least, and then we can find your salvation." "Can I have salvation, Father?" Stanley asked earnestly. "Continue," said the priest. After the first time I followed a girl home, I slowly got better at it. Eventually I developed a set of rules for not getting found out. I never went to the same place more than once, never followed the same girl, and made sure no one recognised me by obscuring my looks. Chose places with less cameras. After I'd somehow gotten away with the first blackout, I knew I had to make every conscious choice around preservation. Otherwise my only pleasure in life would be taken from me along with my freedom. This continued for many years, and I got very good at it. I can't remember the exact number of blackouts, but nothing bad ever came from them. I was too careful in the lead-up, too precise in the selections. But then I broke my own rules. Suddenly, something profoundly shocked Stanley, and he gasped loudly, toppling out of his seat. His head hit the frame of the oak door hard, and it dizzied him. He heard muffled words from the booth next to his. They became more solid. "Are you all right?" I said, called the priest with genuine concern in his voice. I cried a tear." "What?" I cried a tear," repeated Stanley. "I've never done that. It freaked me out a bit." "You poor thing," placed the priest, with tones which emulated distress. "It is clear you have done wrong, but to never feel, to never cry. I cannot imagine a more terrible fate than to be utterly devoid of emotion." Stanley held his gaze on the teardrop, which rested on and covered half of the nail on the back of his index finger. He was wondering if he should somehow try to save it, and the sentimental nature of his thoughts caused his heart to quicken, making him feel faint and hot again. He took his place back on the seat and cast the teardrop aside. "You were saying," said the priest, his shadow shrinking as he neared the veil. "You had broken your own rules. There was a girl, Ali. He shuddered and paused for a moment at the sound of her name. Don't sound like much, I know. But you can't tell from her name. I was struck by her. Obsessed, even. Love? Inquired the priest. No, Father. If I could have felt that, then maybe I could have been saved. Stanley felt more tears building behind his eyes, but he repressed them. Obsession was as close as it got, I think. I have this strange memory of love. Something I felt for someone in a blur when I was very, very young. Love felt simpler, if that was love. Who knows, really? I don't. Can't really understand a thing about emotions, but it didn't feel like it looks in the films, or the way they sing about it in songs. She was beautiful, though. The most beautiful. Like nothing I'd ever known. She made me break my rules, made me follow her more than once, made me go to the same cafe night after night, until I was known and noticed. She made me sloppy. It sounds like you were smitten to me. Taken aback by the priest's ignorant candour, Stanley began to fill with a violent rage, the kind that usually precedes a blackout, and he spat vile swears and curses through the metal divider that, once finished, he could not recall. "You're right, of course," stated the priest. "I should not give my opinions in such a matter. However, I would appreciate it if you also held me in some higher regard than you have just demonstrated, and refrain from using such language in the house of the Lord." Stanley lit another cigarette and finished it in silence. As he stubbed it out on the oaken side panelling of the confessional, he continued, as though his outburst hadn't happened. "I used to watch her, through her bay window. See, she would sit there and read. Sometimes the moon was so brilliant against the pane she could see without her reading lamp. Other times she'd have it on, but always dim, as though she had worked out the exact lighting needed to consume the pages before her at pace, and with a hunger I could see but not quite grasp. Every time I watched her, I found myself turning towards her front door and placing my hand on the handle. It was always unlocked. Obviously, she was protected from the horrors of the real world. If she knew exactly what could be let in, that door would be tightly shut up. But it wasn't, and I would open it just a small amount, and I'd breathe into that room. Then I would stop. I never masturbated to her. I never did anything. Obsessed. I felt like I needed her for some reason. A need greater than my lust or anger. I think slowly the ritual grew less in its satisfaction, and though there was this strangeness to my thoughts, like I could watch her for eternity, I eventually wanted more. More than passing her my breath through a crack in the door. After the 7th or 8th time I pushed on the door until it was completely open, I entered the living room. I wanted her to see me. "Oh, God damn these tears!" Stanley called as they would no longer yield to his will. "No, Stanley," interrupted the priest. "The tears are good. God bless those tears." "No, curse them! They're a curse!" Wait, Stanley." The tears stopped as quickly as they'd burst forth, and were replaced by a dreadful feeling tingling its way across Stanley's skin. How did you know my name?" Stanley shakingly inquired, noticing that he was again becoming fixated by the horrible dark blanks within his memory. "Who are you? Why the hell have I come here?" "Oh dear," said the priest in an utterly other tone to the one he had used before. There was something harder, grittier within it. "I do hate it when I slip up like that. I don't do it often, Stanley, but when I do, it ruins the whole fucking game." Stanley's heart began to pound. There was something deeply wrong here. How had he got into this church? Why had he followed this strange voice inside? He felt some deep knowledge clawing at him, warning him, telling him to get out, to be away from this man. I need some air. Can we pause for a second, please, Father? I need to get out, he called, half ordering, half pleading. Out? The priest questioned in a sickly, macabre tone. I'm afraid that's quite impossible now. Here, Stanley noticed that the oak door in front of him had entirely vanished, leaving nothing but a solid oak wall with not a hint of a crevice that would suggest a route to exit. Panic set in, and his body sprang up, ramming itself against the wall repeatedly. As he did, he could have sworn that he heard the priest laughing, quietly, but maniacally, behind the metal lattice which separated them. "Let me out, priest! Let me out right now!" Stanley demanded. What trick is this? Some kind of magician's box? Put the door back, you freak! Sticks and stones, Stanley. Better a freak than a moron. There is no out, you idiot! Magician's box. That's amusing. Then the priest cried out in joyous exhilaration. Out doesn't exist! There is only here. There is only us. Oh, Stanley, feel the exquisite claustrophobia of it all. The only existence is in the few feet we share. Nothing and no one beyond us. You and me, and an eternity of empty space. Can you feel it, Stan? Can you taste the oblivion? Continue, Stanley. Your confession, Stanley. Confess every single detail to me. Confess every sin. Confess. It's all you'll find yourself able to do. Continue your tale. Stanley felt his own body force itself down onto the chair, which had lost all of its comfort. The deep red of its material became liquid, running like rivers of blood, enveloping him, wanting him to drown. The cushions became stone. He was in a tomb. He was imprisoned in a cramped wooden coffin, and all he could do, all he could form were the harrowing sounds driven out from his throat that formed the words which continued his story, that formed the remainder of his confession. As the words left his motionless lips, his lifeless form collapsed, paralyzed, unable to move, restrained by an invisible spectre and an overwhelming fear. I thought, if only she could see me, if only she could gaze back upon my face, if she could feel how much I wanted her, how much I needed to be inside of her, then she'd understand. Then she'd want me. I killed her. I killed the most beautiful thing I'd seen. I was given this death sentence, this brain cancer, this rotten, malignant tumour shortly after as penance for my dreadful deeds, inserted into my head by a supernatural spectator to pay for my sins. Ever since I found out about it, I've been able to feel feelings, and all I've wanted since I've been able to feel is to apologise. I didn't want her dead. I didn't want her blood on my hands. I wanted to watch her, read and smell her and touch her. I needed to apologise. And first I went round to where it happened, the house where I killed her. I saw her grief-stricken brother through the window, but I was too much of a coward. I couldn't go in, I couldn't face him, or what I'd done, and so I came here. I came for the forgiveness and absolution the Lord may afford me. Stanley's forced speech stopped abruptly, and had the muscles in his throat been working, he may have sputtered and choked, but his whole body remained paralytically lifeless, and at the will of some hidden, demonic commander. Laughed the priest like some asylum-bound jester. Although all was still and lifeless in the box, a sudden cacophony kicked up from outside. There were howls of demonic music, scream like chords calling forth from 100 hellish viols. Stanley began to feel that he was being spun. There was a pressure pushing him further back into his chair. It was as though the confessional had become caught in some otherworldly maelstrom, or nightmarish hurricane. Above the clamour of the hellscape beyond the oak prison rang out the voice of the priest. "You fool, Stanley! Every single time! You'd think this would get old, but my goodness, there is a pleasure in it, Stan. A sick, a damaging pleasure that I can't help but feed upon. Oh, I do apologise. You don't mind me calling you Stan, do you? Stan the man? Speak up if there's a problem. Anything? No? Well, all right, Stanny. Oh, Stan, there's a pleasure in the teasing and a pleasure in the moments just before you realise what's going on. Then there's the ultimate pleasure, the one that comes from pulling you apart with my own teeth and drinking down every part of your accursed soul. You're such a moron. Such an idiot, so stupid! You didn't kill her! What? Stanley screamed, unexpectedly free once more to respond, as though the shock had triggered some deep fighting part of him, which sprang into action. He shouted into the growing storm which howled and reverberated in his mind. "But I went in! I saw her! She made me mad! Then there was blood!" The priest laughed and spat and raged and swore simultaneously, along with the accursed music of the pit. Then the metal veil between them began to bubble, hiss and melt straight onto Stanley's preternaturally restrained left arm. It liquefied his flesh and solidified around his bones. The agony was unspeakable, but he had no power to react, no volition of his own to withdraw his arm. He even found that once again he could not speak, he could not scream. He had to bear the torturous, searing torment in silence, trying desperately to clasp his unblinking eyes tightly shut. He felt his head turning towards the space in the wood where the lattice had been. He didn't want to see what was on the other side. However, he was now merely a pawn to whatever the driving force was behind this supernatural tempest. Without warning or wanting, his eyes brought into vision the twisted and furious face of the beautiful girl from the bay window's brother. "You don't remember, do you? You never remember." The brother's face contorted and shifted, melted and multiplied. It became solid, then liquid, before reimagining itself into a half-horned beast and a half-smiling jester. "Well now, it's my confession." The brother's voice was his own, but was tinged by a second, quieter and more feminine. "Now it's my turn to talk. When you entered the house that night, it wasn't my sister who was waiting for you. It was me. She'd seen you the last 2 times, following her home. Both times, it was on the same day of the week. She'd noticed you too, watching outside of the bay window, and heard your hand rattling at the door. Looks like you weren't as good at being unseen as you thought." Stanley began to quiver, to shake, almost in a seizure-like manner. He was attempting to force himself up from the chair, attempting to escape. The brother laughed mockingly at his attempts, and the corners of his face grew into a dizzyingly high smile with nauseatingly jagged edges. "And if you escape, Stanley?" called the priest. "Where would you go? Don't you get it, Stanley? Don't you realize where we are yet? Or are you just choosing not to remember now? Stanley! There is nothing beyond the space which is needed for me to torture you. Nothing exists. If you weren't paralyzed and you pounded for 1,000,000 years at the wood before you, you would never make so much as a dent. Because nothing else exists. There is nothing outside of your coffin, Stanley. Nothing. Only what I will there to be. And I will nothing. Nothing for you but an eternal prison. Now listen very carefully, because when I finish my story, it'll all come flooding back in. I promise. On the very last word, your stubbornness will subside, and you'll have no choice but to remember. I can't wait, Stanley. The brother's tone grew ever more clown-like, ever more cruelly joyous. I can already taste the unceasing horror. I'm getting tingles thinking about your anguish. Here we go. She knew you were coming, and so I was waiting for you. You lunged at me, Stanley, hands pressing tightly at my throat. Remember this? Here, the brother pushed his face close to Stanley's so he could see his own struggling and petrified reflection in the brother's bulging, reddening eyes. The brother was choking and gagging and taking on a terribly bluish tinge. Suddenly and violently, the maelstrom consumed the confessional whole. Stanley was tossed from side to side, spinning and swirling to a hideously unending depth, until the living room, her living room, melted back into view. Stanley had been transported back to the night he had entered her house, but it wasn't Ali in front of him. It was the brother, and he was choking in Stanley's hands. He noticed very quickly that he could move again, and Stanley wasted no time in pressing his thumbs harder into the brother's windpipe, feeling it crush and cave within his vice-like grip. The brother fell to his knees, dying, and Stanley knelt down with him, matching him, pressing his face close to the dying man's glazing, fogging eyes and smiling into them. Then, something odd pressed itself against Stanley's stomach. It didn't feel like much at first, just cold. However, when he looked down, he saw the brother's hand holding on to the handle of a knife that was deeply embedded into him. Blooms of blood began to ooze across his t-shirt. He started to weaken and lose his grip around the brother's throat. He could feel his consciousness failing. He was dizzying, becoming close to passing out, but instead he used the small reserve of strength he had left to punch the brother hard in the face. This created a small gap between the pair and gave Stanley just enough time to pull the knife out of his own guts and drive it into the jugular of the brother. Stanley collapsed shortly after, shivering on the floor, and the last thing he saw before darkness descended was his own blood crawling its way along the rough and raucously patterned carpet to mingle and combine with the blood of the brother. After the darkness, Stanley came to, back in the confessional. He retained the ability to move and the ability to speak, but now the box was closed on all sides, and Stanley could gain no sight of the brother, though his presence could still be distinctly felt. "We killed each other," said Stanley in a slow, dawning realization. "And now we're here. Together. Our blood." The brother cackled blissfully, seemingly from all directions. "But don't you see?" Stanley shouted finally. "You're in hell too. It's not just me. You've given way to revenge. You've let your desire for it corrupt you." Stanley stood. "It's not I alone who must suffer through eternity, but you as well. You must suffer in your anger repeatedly, forever." As Stanley called this out, 1,000 versions of his own terror-stricken face, echoing down a mirrored corridor, appeared in front of him. Each mirror contained a familiar event, a past torture served up by the brother. But each one was set against differing backdrops, different locations, differing contexts. "You've become a demon," Stanley continued, momentarily blotting out the truth of his infinitely looping, hellish existence. "You're torturing a soul committed to hell. You're in the thrall of Satan. You're as much of a monster as I am," Stanley cried, as the memory of a billion horrifying endings pushed their way into his mind. A never-ceasing slew of torment that he had been through and was still going to go through forever. The brother smiled menacingly from somewhere beyond Stanley's perception and began to chortle maniacally once more. Oh, I know, but the way I see it, I'd much sooner be on this side of the pitchfork poking than the one being poked. And I'll tell you something, Stanley. After all these millennia, I may have given some way towards madness, but the look of absolute dread on your face every time you realize your fate still gives me the shivers. I could drink your anguish like the finest wine. The brother paused, and then inhaled an excited breath. Oh, I feel it, Stanley. Don't you? We're about to start over anew. I wonder where we'll go next time. One thing is for sure. The brother's mocking voice suddenly seemed impossibly far off and was fading fast. I'll see you in hell! Stanley's vision became clouded as the swirling hellscape of his infinite screaming faces grew colder and dimmer until there was nothing left but darkness and silence. Then there was no existence at all for a while, until there was again. Stanley fell against the cold, hard steps that led up to the courthouse, not knowing exactly how he'd gotten there. He couldn't quite recall why he had been summoned, and his mind was thick. He knew he had to enter. He knew he had to fight for his life, to protest and grasp at his freedom. Surely they couldn't know about the girl. He'd thought about confessing it to the brother in the past, but he hadn't. No, that wasn't it. That wasn't why he was here. But the pieces didn't quite make sense for the moment, and there was something else too. It was as though, in the darkened and unclear sections of Stanley's memory, there hid a secret. Something he couldn't quite grasp. Almost as though it were being purposefully obscured. And he'd be damned if it wasn't something truly terrible in its nature. Well, looks like Stanley figured out the mystery. Or rather, figured it out again and again and again and again forever. Fear not, though, listeners. The brother's wrath may not last eternally, and should Stanley ever be released from his recurring torture, we have a wonderful place saved just for him, here in the Horror Story Corner. Thank you for listening, and as ever, sleep well.